Welcome into One of One Sports. Today we have another college football record prediction video, this time with last year's national champions, the Ohio State Buckeyes. So looking at last year's schedule, the Ohio State Buckeyes went 10-2 in the regular season before winning four straight games in the college football playoff to finish 14-2 and eventually win the national championship. Now, this was obviously a very successful season. I mean, you won the whole title. That's the whole point. But you didn't win the Big Ten title and you didn't beat your rival Michigan for the fourth year in a row. So there's still something to prove this year. Like, you should still have somewhat of a chip on your shoulder even coming off a very successful season. And if Ryan Day loses to Michigan again, the fans are going to kind of mad him. Like, he's not completely off the hook just because he won, as you might expect him to be, or at least most other people would be, because of the unique scenario of how big that rivalry is and how much they have struggled in the recent years. So looking at what Ohio State lost from last season, they come in with only 48% returning production. That's 92nd in the country, 14th in the Big Ten. So obviously, they lost a lot. And going through it, you lose your quarterback, Will Howard. You lose both your bell cow running backs, Quinshon Judkins, Travion Henderson. You lose your second best receiver, Emeka Egbuka. You lose tight end G. Scott. You lose Josh Simmons, Seth McLaughlin, Donovan Jackson, and Josh Fryer from the O-line. That's just the offensive side of the ball. On defense, you lose DBs Lathan Ransom. You lose, where's he at? Denzel Burke, Jordan Hancock. You lose your top tackler at linebacker, Kobe Simon. And on the D-line, you lose Jackson Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Tyleik Williams, all going to be NFL guys. All were drafted to the NFL. So obviously a ton is gone. So it's going to be a whole new team if you're looking to repeat. Pretty much everything is gone, building fresh. In terms of what you do add to this new team, Max Clare, a tight end from Purdue, should be an impact transfer, one of the better tight ends in the Big Ten right away. CJ Donaldson, running back, West Virginia. You bring in a few O linemen, the best of which probably Ethan Aniwa. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Have not really familiar with him from Rice, or Philip Daniels from Minnesota is the other big O lineman you brought in. And then Bo Atkinson, edge rusher from North Carolina, rounds out your major transfer additions. And then you did bring in the fifth best recruiting class in the country, highlighted by Devin Sanchez, five-star cornerback, Quincy Porter, five-star wide receiver, Tavian St. Clair, five-star quarterback. Now, what do you return? You return Jeremiah Smith, probably the best player in all of college football. As a true freshman, broke pretty much every wide receiver record Ohio State had for freshmen, and it looks to be the very best in a long line of great Ohio State wide receivers. You also return Carnell Tate and Brandon Inniss, making up a very strong wide receiver group. You return James Peoples at running back. He's really the only running back you're returning, so even though he didn't do much last year, look for him to have a bigger role. Julian Sayin comes in at quarterback, look to take over the starting job. Caleb Downs. If Jeremiah Smith isn't the best player in the country, it might be because safety Caleb Downs is. He's awesome. And then Igbenogsom at corner, Styles at linebacker, and CJ Hicks is a guy who was injured, but he's extremely talented. He's coming back. I think he could play a much bigger role this upcoming season on the defensive side of the ball. One last thing you lost, though, before we get into the prediction, is Jim Knowles, defensive coordinator. He heads over to Penn State, and he had been, like, before Jim Knowles came in, Ohio State had been slipping in defense, and then he's brought them to be the best defense arguably in all of college football last year. So I do think that is a big loss, and when you combine that with all the players you're losing, I do think they could take a step back defensively. So continuing with that, yeah, the strengths of this team are going to be the wide receiver core. Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, Brandon Inniss is a ridiculous trio that pretty much no one's going to be able to cover. And then the secondary, I think, is going to be very strong as well. Like I mentioned, Caleb Downs, best safety in the country, but Igbenogsom can be good as well. And there's just a lot of talent back there. Even a guy like Devin Sanchez is a true freshman. I wouldn't be surprised if he makes an impact. Weaknesses, the O-line, maybe it's not a weakness, but when you lose, like I said, let me pull it up again real quick. Donovan Jackson, Seth McLaughlin, Josh Simmons, Josh Fryer. Even though you bring these transfers, I do have question marks about that O-line. And then defensive drop-off, what I just talked about with Jim Knowles, losing your best players, Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Tyleik Williams. The defensive front, not going to be nearly as good. At least you wouldn't think so. And then the X factor here is probably Julian Sayin. Like, how good is he going to be in his first year starting? Is he going to be Will Howard level? Is he going to be CJ Stroud level? I think that would be really lofty and a lot to expect from someone. And I would lean more towards approaching what Will Howard was for you, not as a runner, but just overall in terms of quality of quarterback play. Now getting to the schedule, Ohio State scheduled a huge game in week one, home game against Texas, which is probably going to be a top five matchup when the AP poll comes out. Two ridiculously stacked team and a rematch of the game, college football semifinal last year, which was really competitive. Jack Sawyer eventually getting that pick six on Quinn Ewers to seal the deal late into that one. Breaking this one down, I think a big storyline is going to be two new quarterbacks, right? How does Arch Manning handle going on the road into the shoe? How does Julian Sayin handle his first ever career start against a team as talented as Texas? Texas has a lot more coming back, which leads me to favor them a little bit in terms of a week one matchup. I also think Ohio State's O line's not going to be ready for Colin Simmons, Trey Moore, Anthony Hill bringing some pressure. And I could see Julian Sayin making some mistakes. And Michael Taft leads a strong Texas secondary for next year, which can at least somewhat challenge Ohio State's elite receivers, but I do think they'll still make plays. But defensively, I don't expect Ohio State to provide the same type of pressure to Arch Manning. And he's at least started some games. He's more experienced. I expect him to have a better game than Sayin. And even though Ohio State's at home, I think they do open the season with a loss to the Texas Longhorns and Steve Sarkisian. I then think you obviously bounce back with two wins against Grambling and Ohio. Not really anything to say there. And then you get a pretty early bye, but I don't mind it because I think Washington's going to be tough this year, and at Washington's a tough pace to play. Like I could see Damon Williams doing some good things in this game, especially running the ball. Jonah Coleman should be good, and I think Washington will actually be really competitive. But I'm not sure that they have the secondary to hold up. And at this point, Julian Sayin, I think, is somewhat finding his groove off of bye week. They're going to be well rested. You'll still be healthy early in the year. And I think Ohio State can go on the road and win a hard fought game against the Huskies. And then coming back home, you beat Minnesota. Minnesota, I don't like their quarterback play this year. I think they'll have a decent defense and a good run game, but I don't think they have enough explosiveness to keep up with this Ohio State team. And it's kind of the same deal for Illinois. Even though they return a bunch, Luke Altmaier, there's not a lot on the perimeter, and their defense I don't like enough. I think this would be a really, really big day for Jeremiah Smith. And I think a lot of people see this as a trap game, have Illinois ranked really highly. I'm not seeing that. I think this is clearly an Ohio State win. And then a double road game to Wisconsin, another team I'm not that high on. Don't love Billy Edwards at quarterback. Don't think you have a lot of explosiveness on the outside. And for these teams like Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, not Washington, because I think Washington can score. I just think Ohio State's clearly going to put up points, and I don't see, even with Ohio State regressing defensively, any of these teams getting into a shootout with them and coming out on top. So I have Ohio State starting 6-1 before their last bye week of the season. A pretty great spot for the bye week before a home game and arguably your biggest or toughest game of the year. You could argue Texas, you could argue Penn State, you could argue Michigan. But at least in this thing, they have Penn State as preseason number one, according to FBS schedules. But yeah, there's a bunch of storylines here in terms of James Franklin. Depending on if he's beaten Oregon or not, how high are they ranked? Is this a top 3 matchup, top 5 matchup? Are we talking about James Franklin can't win the big game? He never beats Ohio State. That kind of thing. And then looking on the field, Penn State is one of the leaders in returning production this year, kind of the polar opposite of Ohio State. You're going to have Drew Aller, the much more experienced quarterback, coming on the road here. Penn State's got, I would think, the better O-line, the better run game. They have a better D-line, I think, led by Zane Durant and Denai Sutton. They have at least an on-par secondary led by A.J. Harris and a pretty good linebacking group as well. So I think on paper, Penn State is pretty much better across the board except wide receiver and maybe secondary. So I do think Penn State is going to come into this even on the road thinking we should beat Ohio State, but they just haven't done it before. And I think there's been other times in games where Penn State's had it and they just find a way to blow it. I don't trust them, especially not on the road in a game this big. Don't know if this will be big noon or in prime time, but until I see James Franklin winning, not a big game against like Oregon, I need like big wins against Michigan and Ohio State for me to trust him. Right now I can't. So even though I think on paper they're better, I got to give it to Ohio State just off the history of what James Franklin's been doing at Penn State. Then Purdue, not going to be good at all in the Big Ten. Easy win for Ohio State. UCLA, Nico Yamuyalava, pretty good, but at home, not challenging. Rutgers, not challenging. I think after Penn State, 3 of the weakest opponents you can get in the Big Ten this year, in my opinion. You should absolutely roll before a road game against Michigan, who at this point I think is probably a team peaking late in the season. Bryce Underwood now with 11 games under his belt is going to be playing his best football. The O-line, which is talented, should be at its best as well. The defense, I think, will be good all season, really. But you would assume is the young guys at least are stepping up, or some of the more inexperienced players. The run game should be there. Who knows what the receiving core will be, but I can't imagine it's worse than last year. And I think it's a team that can compete with Ohio State, but Ohio State is more talented. Like Michigan maybe has the quarterback edge. We'll see how good Bryce Underwood is. But outside of that, Ohio State still recruits better. They bring in better transfers. And even losing as much as they did, Michigan also lost a ton to the NFL draft, and guys like Colston Loveland, Donovan Edwards, C.J. Mullings, who am I forgetting? Will Johnson, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant. They lost a ton as well. So it's not exactly like Michigan's a leader in returning production. But this is where I kind of do the same thing with Penn State. Like Ryan Day last year had a team capable of winning the national championship, a team that had about the best roster that money could buy. And like it worked. You won the national title. But even last year, with as much of a talent discrepancy as you had against a Michigan team that was getting terrible quarterback play out of Davis Warren and could not score at all against, you had the best defense in the country. You still found a way to blow that game. So I just, like early in the Jim Harbaugh era, I couldn't pick Michigan to beat Ohio State because they were just losing every year. That's how it is now. Like I have to see it to believe it. I'm picking Michigan to beat Ohio State, and I'm picking the Buckeyes to finish 10-2, losing the first game of the season, losing the last game, winning everything in between. So 10-2, but just one conference loss. So depending on how the other teams do, and I'll have Penn State videos, Oregon videos, Michigan videos, and if there's any other teams you want to see in the Big Ten, comment them down below, and I will see if I can get to them. But the Buckeyes will have a chance to reach the Big Ten championship. That's all I have for today's video. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and until next time.